read a little bit in the Old Testament now. We're going to begin in Exodus. No, actually we're going to begin in Leviticus 18. Now, you probably know the Bible well enough to know that Leviticus isn't the first book. But we're going to begin with the verse in Leviticus. Can anybody guess why I want to begin in Leviticus? To whom was Leviticus written originally? Written to the priests. It's also to the people because it's called a handbook for the priests, but that's a bit of a misnomer. We'll come to that later. Written for Israel. Israel when? Okay, after actually in conjunction with them receiving the Ten Commandments, which is when? Think through your walkthrough. You know this. Mount Sinai, where they get Torah, and Leviticus is part of Torah. All right? Why am I starting there? Well, who were the first people to read the book of Genesis? Adam? Eve? Cain? Nimrod? Noah? Who wrote the book of Genesis? Moses. So the first readers of the book of Genesis were the Israelites just as they or after they came out of Egypt. Moses is the author of the book of Genesis. Now there's a whole lot of information there. In fact, all of the information there occurred before the time of Moses. How do you suppose he knew all that stuff? Huh? Divine revelation? History? The stories passed down the patriarchs and so forth. He may have had some written sources. We don't know. But Moses is the man who penned the book of Genesis for the original readership, Israel, as they were coming out of Egypt. Why did God include the material in Genesis for this nation as they came out of Egypt? And that's the question I want to start with in our class as we begin to think through the what is this all about part of our Old Testament survey. And this book in Leviticus, or this verse, a couple of verses in Leviticus, kind of gets us into the heart of the initial thrust of this material, what it was that this material was to accomplish and do for this group of people who had been in Egypt for how long? And their condition was bondage. And Moses brings them out. Why? Well, we have a command here. In Leviticus 18 it says, "Do not defile yourselves with any of these things, for by all these the nations are defiled, which I am casting out before you. For the land is defiled. Therefore I visit the punishment of its iniquity upon it, and the land vomits out its inhabitants. You shall therefore keep my statutes and my judgments, and shall not commit any of these abominations, lest the land vomit you out also when you defile it, as it vomited out the nations that were before you." Now the word land occurs several times in these verses. What land is the center of our story? The land of Canaan. All right? The Canaanites are in this land. And he warns them, as you leave Egypt, do not defile yourself with the practices and the understandings of the Canaanites. Now, I had you do some reading last week on Canaanites. What did you find? And the Canaanites or Mesopotamian religion or Egyptian religion, generally they fall into very similar categories. They were coming out of Egypt. They weren't to go back to Egypt spiritually or physically. They were going into Canaan, and they were not to become like the Canaanites. What are some of the characteristics you found of these people? And I'll just jot them down as you share them. Polytheist. Oh, there you go. P-O-L. Poly. P-O-L. How do you spell that? Yeah, that's right. Polytheists. What else? That's close enough, huh? What? Violent. What else? Astrologers. Sensual. Okay, they had common myths of origin, etc. All right. Gods, okay. Or their gods are like them. That's a little different, but yeah. Okay, what else? Is that 2 P's or 1? Yeah. Yeah, I grew up not knowing how to spell. Yes? Child sacrifices. Robbie? What's divination? Okay, how? Okay, they could, take an animal and look at its organs or various means. Okay, good, safe method for guidance. What else? Oh, this is still set on the thing to reduce the size. That's going to be convenient. What else? Other people haven't shared something, if there's any different. Yes? Agricultural, how do you mean? Okay, so, yeah, they're the gods of nature, and spent a lot of time appeasing the gods so that the rain would fall and the crops would grow. All right, so their worship had everything to do with just their daily life and so forth, and so a lot of manipulation of the gods to secure productivity, and fecundity is the word they use. It means you produce a lot. Okay, yeah, sure. They what? Okay. Borrowed from each other. All right, what else? Somebody here, yeah.
Yeah, I was in the Egyptians, and it seems like their architecture is closely related to their religion, especially the Egyptians, because pyramids are very connected with the ideas of mythology of creation and the beginning of God, and also Pharaoh.
All right. Okay. So their culture and their artistic things really centered a lot in their religion, and you see it reflected and affecting each other. Mm-hmm. Okay, but that's getting us. Yeah, all right, but. Okay, I think there very much was demonism. They wouldn't have called it that, but demonism involved in what motivated them and what they would see as powers. All right, okay. That presence. Other things I mentioned, yes. Far away. And that's true. These religions, you did not have a hope of a relationship with the God. The best you could do was avoid the God's wrath or manipulate the God's pleasure. And so it was a very impersonal type of religion. Somebody down here had some, yeah. Okay. Have you ever tried to type in front of a room full of people? Try it sometime. It's kind of scary. Yeah, go ahead. Didn't like change? What context did you surface that in? Okay, so you just see a continuity over centuries and centuries and centuries? Okay, all right. All right. What else? Okay, so the humans are created as servants. All right. Yeah.
There were around 2,000 to 3,000 gods for the Mesopotamians, so there must have been a god for just about everything.
Okay, so gobs of gods. Yeah. Okay. In the Egyptian, that is a strong characteristic of Egyptian religion, the divinity of the Pharaoh. All right? Yeah. Good works. Karma is probably what it might be called today. How do you spell karma? K, just A-R-M-A. There's no H in there. That's right, karma. All right. So yeah. It was, and again, that's part of the manipulation. We'll do what pleased the gods, and yet that isn't connected with morality. You see. You caught that. That morality is not an issue, but what pleased or displeased the god. And the gods were often immoral, as we would consider it, in the way they carried on. So, all right, what else?
Well, for creation, it seems like there's like 12 or more myths. I think it's something that was copied, with some that's copied by the Greeks too, because it seems like it's a pastime of philosophers to make up new ideas.
You mean in terms of creation traditions?
Or anything. All traditions. It seems like there's huge stories behind everything. Same with Greek mythology.
Yeah, okay, all right. Yeah, they had a sense of time, past, present, future. So they weren't simply living like animals instinctually just for today. So they have the myths. They would look to the myths as that which would give them some information about who they are, where they came from. And there would be a sense of the future. If we don't have rain, we won't have food. If we don't have food, we won't live next year. All right? And even a sense of the afterlife. So all of that is, that's pretty complex, isn't it? You'll often hear that the evolutionary idea that religion started very, very simply, and then, as time went, man evolved. They evolved into all these complex understandings of the world and so forth. Is that what you saw as you read this material? That they're so much different in terms of these kinds of abilities to conceptualize? No. They had pretty involved ideas of origins and of history and of what's going on in the world and how they would relate to it. All whacked up, but pretty involved, okay? All right, what else? Yeah. No kidding. No kidding. Well, let's stop right there, because that's where I wanted to get anyway. I was going to ask you, how many of you would have, just really hated living back then as opposed to now? Most of you would probably say, yeah, I'd really hate living back then. I wouldn't have an iPod. And I wouldn't, But in terms of the morality, in terms of the ideas, in terms of the practices, our world really is Canaan in many, many ways, is it not? Anybody disagree with that? In fact, some of you have come out of, some really negative types of influence. Whether they be moral, ideological, social, relational. And I'm not talking about families, though that can be, but just, your communities, if you went to public schools. We live in a world that really isn't in basic, the way people are, isn't a whole lot different than what these religions are, is it? And in fact, the United States is going back toward that at a rapid pace. And so Moses is writing to a people who are to be different. And one of the ways that difference is characterized is you are going to be different than the Canaanites. God has given you Torah. God has given you instruction. He has given you a morality. He has given you character qualities. And you are to live in that way. And when you do, what you're going to do is you're going to reflect positively on the God who created you, who preserved you, who brought you out of Egypt, who gave you this land, who drove out the people before you. And so Genesis is written, because we're going to go to Genesis, but I want to put Genesis in its context. Genesis is not written as a scientific textbook or a historical treatise, though it includes information that is useful to both of those pursuits. It is written as the background for the nation of Israel as to who they were, where they came from. And so, this is at the heart, and this is what God is doing in giving them Torah. And He's preparing them to be a special, unique people. And we will look more at why He was doing that. You've got some notes now. Let's kind of start working through our notes. This would be on page 10, new notes. Page 10. And you can fill in some blanks, and you can use it for note-taking for other things I say. I've given you some stuff so you don't have to write everything. Someday we'll talk about note-taking. Genesis is an introduction to Exodus and to the rest of the Pentateuch. The Pentateuch being the 5 books of Moses. Penta, all right, 5. Because the Israelites needed to know, and you have this in your notes, where they had come from, who their ancestors were. It's important to know those kinds of things. Some of you may have been raised without knowing who your parents were. And there's always that desire, who am I? Even if you know your family, it's interesting to trace your family's history. Who are our ancestors? Where did Grandma and Grandpa come from? Was my great-great-grandfather a train robber? Or he was, a Methodist preacher? I mean, it makes a difference sometimes. Why they were in Egypt instead of Canaan? What did God promise to Abraham? Land. We've started to talk about that. That's where they were headed. But why were they in Egypt? Genesis sets the background for that. Why they had been in Egypt for 400 years. Genesis answers that. Why they were being oppressed and abused. And Genesis comments upon that. And what it was that God had in store for them. What it was that He was purposing for them to do. Coming out of Egypt is not the beginning of the story for Israel. It's a continuation of something that happened far beyond that, before that. Identity and destiny. You can write those in those little boxes. Identity and destiny. They're inextricably linked. who I am and where I'm headed are integrally connected. And so Genesis is written as the background, as providing the information that Moses would use to communicate to Israel who they were and why they existed as a people and what their destiny was. They were not setting it, God had. And so Genesis is important, first of all, for that. Beginnings are necessary for understanding ends. If you don't know where you began, you can't help to know where you end up. Now, you may not think that works, in life generally, everywhere. It does pretty much, though. Beginnings are necessary for understanding ends. If you don't understand Genesis, you don't have a ghost of a notion of understanding Revelation. That's the end. It's the end as far as we've been communicated. But Genesis sets the tone and the direction of everything that happens through the Bible. Genesis means beginning. The genesis of something is the beginning of something, and that's why we find it. Bereshit, in the beginning. And that's where the title of the book comes from. And Genesis gives essential information for answering the big questions in life. Questions like, who am I? It answered the question for Israel, who are we? What are we as a people? Well, as individuals born into this world, no matter how you were born, who you were born to, what the circumstances of that was, Genesis is the foundation for that most important question, answering that most important question. Why are we here? What's the problem? All people know that there is a problem of human existence. There is a frustration to it. There is an enigma to it. There is a negative aspect to it. Well, what is it? Where does it come from? And where are we going? What's the purpose, the destiny? Where are we headed? And how do we get there? These are the big questions in life. We will look at these in a different way and in great detail second semester in Intro to Philosophy, Christian Worldview, which is a course that I teach. But these are the questions that all people need answers for, and all people adopt some kind of an answer for. And your Canaanites and your Mesopotamians and your Egyptians had answers for every one of these questions. Well, we came from the battle between Tiamat and, Yam and blah, 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 blah. Well, everybody has to have some sense of an answer to these questions in order to function in life. And Genesis gives that for the nation of Israel, but also for humanity in general. Who am I? Well, we're personal creatures, and this is just a summary answer. We are personal creatures. Genesis says we come from the personal God who created us like Himself, as His image bearers. And that makes all the difference. Why are we here? We're here to exercise dominion. We'll talk more about that. What's the problem? Well, we are rebels under a curse, and we need restoration from the effects of that curse. And so the Bible presents where we came from, what the problem is with why we're here, what's hindering us from what we were created to be. And it says there is a solution to those problems. Where are we going? Well, the creation needs restoration. And so God has a purpose for history. God has a purpose for the earth. He has an end, a goal that the earth is going to come to. And how do we get there? Well, it's God who will restore blessing, who will restore to an original condition the earth as He created it before the problems entered. And Genesis gives us the foundational information to begin to answer those questions. to answer them in fully and to track them through. And God has given us an expansive answer to those questions. So Genesis is the introduction. It's a long introduction to the major event of Israel coming out of the Exodus, coming out of Egypt in the Exodus.